stay tuned because for the next 60 minutes, Motorsports Unlimited is on the air. Hi, I'm Jerry Bryant, and these are the lovely ladies of motorsports. And all this hour, we're going to have 60 minutes of action-packed excitement. All kinds of exciting things will happen. And we got the famous Bill Wildt, and we got all kinds of other good stuff that's happening all this hour. Motorsports Unlimited, 60 minutes of non-stop action. So let's go to the studio right now, huh?
Thanks, Jerry, and hi, everybody. Welcome to the studio headquarters of Chicagoland's most watched, most talked about Access television series. I'm Bill Wildt, and this is the 1,422nd edition of Motorsports Unlimited. Today, we return to our explanation of what Motorsports Unlimited has been all about for the past 30-plus years. As explained many times, our interest is the survival of motorsport and all of the attendant things that activity provides. As I am writing this, it is April 7th, 2019, and I just finished watching the NASCAR race from Bristol, Tennessee. Before I proceed, let me make it clear. I do not speak for NASCAR, nor would I be the person they would select to speak for them. Rather, I speak as an observer, and this event, which I thought was very entertaining, reminded me that I should take a moment to mention NASCAR, as I am often presented with, "What about NASCAR?" as I try to make my case about motorsport's disappearance from America. I have stated over and over again that motorsport is disappearing from our culture because we have been omitted from network television sports news for nearly 70 years. Certainly, despite this reality, NASCAR has succeeded in making America conscious of high-level stock car racing, and they are to be congratulated for that near impossible achievement. But it changes nothing. Try to think of motorsport as the Titanic. You know, the ship that sank in the Atlantic in 1912 after striking an iceberg? If you will recall, the Titanic passengers were broken up along economic lines. Those with the cheapest tickets were located in the bowels of the ship, some called steerage. Those located higher up bought more expensive tickets, and those with the most resources were located in the luxury suites high up above the waterline. Think of motorsport like the Titanic. At the bottom of the heap, steerage, get it, are the local tracks. I don't mean local as in how close it is to your house. I mean local as in tracks that attract locals, people who live in the area, racers who live in the area, as opposed to those tracks that draw people and participants from all over the country. I suppose there are people who live near the Bristol track and attend the NASCAR race, but it certainly isn't a local track. Bristol is a unique facility that seats some 160,000 people. Economically, it needs nationwide attention to sustain itself. When I say local, I'm talking about the small drag strips and short tracks that dot our country. At least they used to. As a matter of fact, one of the prime motivators that provoked me to start Motorsports Unlimited was when I stumbled on information that in 1953, there were more than 2,500 racetracks in this country, and by the early 70s, there were fewer than 800. It didn't take a genius to figure out that we were at risk. The question for me was, why? And what could be done about it, if anything? I'll get back to it, but first I want to finish up my Titanic comparison. A decade ago, a ticket to the Bristol race was the toughest ticket to come by in all of NASCAR. You see, Bristol is a short track, and it takes real drivers, not just the biggest wind tunnel in the deepest pockets, to compete and eventually win. Oh, I'm not saying the race teams that compete at Bristol don't have engineers or their work isn't important at Bristol. Of course it is, because at its core, motorsport is a marriage of man and machine. The machine is important, but Bristol isn't about aero or seeing the air. It's about a man and a machine doing battle with other equally talented and equally equipped men and machines. Real race fans know this is a recipe for great drivers' duels and flock to Bristol to see the best that all of the local short tracks around the country produce and eventually end up in NASCAR doing battle wheel to wheel. And Bristol is probably the closest thing NASCAR has to those roots. The April 2019 Bristol race was a great battle. What wasn't great was what appeared to be the half-empty house. It was alarming to me. I mean, what had happened where the once hottest ticket in NASCAR couldn't find ticket buyers? Now keep in mind, once again, I in no way speak for NASCAR, and they operate on a completely different business model that I can't even imagine. My concern is, remember the Titanic example I was working on? When the Titanic sank, there were many people in steerage who had already drowned. They were dead, while the folks in the luxury cabins high up were still not aware the ship was sinking. Some 30 years ago, I was warning of the impending demise of the motorsport community if we didn't solve the problem of being omitted by network television sports news. 30 years later, still omitted. The difference now is there is nothing left to omit. As a matter of fact, just a couple of years ago, I detailed the loss of the Chicago and Chicago area racetracks. In short, they are all gone, just as I expected and predicted. All the tracks I started at as a young man, gone. And they all failed for the same reason: failure to generate enough revenue to fund themselves and flourish. I've been over all this before on previous episodes of Motorsports Unlimited, so I'll shorthand it if you've forgotten. Essentially, my position is, and always has been, motorsport is a competitor in the sports entertainment marketplace, and as such, it has to do at least two things to survive. First, it must do everything it can to compete. I've been through all this before, and I don't want to do it again. You know, stuff like making sure your entity has a welcoming, comfortable atmosphere, of course, a good show, and all the rest. Again, I've been through all this. Look back at previous explanation shows. Second, and this is the part the motorsport community usually forgets and perhaps doesn't understand, make sure your competitors for public attention don't have an unfair and perhaps illegal advantage. The dollars out there people are willing to spend on entertainment are not infinite, so you have to compete for a fair share. What am I talking about? Who are our competitors? Your competitors are the rich guys in baseball, basketball, football, et al. You know, the folks network television has been reminding people about at least 4 times a day, 7 days a week for nearly 70 years. The people who have been granted free television promotion under the phony guise of news. You know, it never ceases to amaze me that we allow those with access to the public airwaves to remain unchallenged for their nonstop promotion of those we compete with for public attention. It really says something about us I'm still sorting out. I mean, one would think when something is killing you, one would hear a cry of objection at the very least. You know, now that I think about it, that may be the very heart of our dilemma. It's not that people aren't crying out. How on earth would anyone hear the cry if the law denied them the ability to be heard? I mean, there may be many screaming their heads off, but if they are denied access to America's only viable communications medium, television, how would they be heard? When O'Hare Stadium closed forever in 1968, there was no coverage of it on network television sports news. When Santa Fe Speedway closed forever in 1995, there was no coverage of it on network television sports news. When Raceway Park closed forever in 2000, there was no coverage of it on network television sports news. When Iliana Motor Speedway closed forever in 2016, there was no coverage of it on network television sports news. These and more closed as they operated, omitted from America's only viable communications medium. You know, when Congress passed the Radio Act of 1927 that essentially turned America's communications medium over to a tiny privileged few, they effectively silenced the rest of the population. Of course, they couldn't possibly have known in 1927 that television would become America's only viable communications medium. But I knew it by the mid and certainly by the late 50s when I wrote my first letter to network television. My plea was simple. Please come and cover our events. We will roll out the red carpet for you, or we'll leave you completely alone. Whatever you want, just please cover our events. I could see the handwriting on the wall. If you didn't have a presence on television, you didn't exist, and there was no way one could compete for audience with those who did have a presence on television. One by one, little by little, over the years, we lost every one of the Chicago area tracks. Sadly, it wasn't just the Chicago area tracks. It was all of the local tracks all over the country. And the reason was always the same, and it has nothing to do with rising property values or noise complaints, as is commonly and erroneously offered to explain. Don't be deceived. It was failure to generate enough revenue to fund themselves and flourish. In the meantime, those who received network television sports news attention succeeded economically beyond anyone's wildest imagination. Quite a contrast in fortunes. The part the motorsport community seems to have the greatest difficulty understanding is all the money in the sports entertainment marketplace comes from audience. Now think about that. Audience. It doesn't make any difference if we're talking about people buying tickets or signing a contract for a television deal or contracts for merchandising or selling t-shirts. The desirability and value of all of this is dependent on audience. That's what pays the bills. Our survival is directly dependent on our ability to attract audience. And if we are to survive, that thought should never leave our minds. Now, I said earlier, the half-full stands at Bristol Speedway during the April 2019 event alarmed me. You see, in America, NASCAR is the top of the motorsport heap. NASCAR is to motorsport what the luxury upper suites on the Titanic represented to that disaster. I hope you understand what I'm saying. As one who is concerned about the survival of motorsport and having watched one local track after another disappear during the past 50 years, I can't help but think if we lose NASCAR, the motorsport ship has sunk, and there will be no retrieval. NASCAR has enjoyed enormous popularity in the past, and I keep my fingers crossed about the future, but I'm not encouraged. My guess is, like those on the upper decks of the Titanic, NASCAR failed to notice the loss of the small short tracks dotting our country, and probably were not aware that entities like motorsport and trees and all growing things don't die from the top down. They die from the bottom up. Kill the roots and you'll eventually kill the tree. Or more in line with my example, the Titanic didn't sink from the top down. It sank from the bottom up. By the time doom found its way to the upper decks, where there may have been people who could have done something about it if they knew earlier, all was already lost. Now, I know there are those who would say the reason for the loss of attendance at many NASCAR events is people didn't like the new rules package, or Bristol screwed up the track when they rebuilt it, and well, the list goes on, petty stuff that is always part of any entity. Then there are those who point out the dramatic attendance loss came with our nation's economic collapse of 2007-2008. I personally think that may be closer to the truth. The booming economy network television keeps screaming from the rooftops isn't booming for the middle class. As of 2019, most of the population of America is in a deep depression. Of course, you wouldn't know it because only wealthy people get to communicate on television, and they are positively giddy about the economy. Actually, I was curious about network television's giddy presentation of the economy. It certainly didn't reflect my observation. Just for the heck of it, I looked up the salary of one of the network television's teleprompter readers. It happened to be a woman, and I was shocked to learn she was being paid $2 million a year. I was stunned. It seemed to defy the rules of economics. It's a $5 an hour job at best, and talented people line up 1,000 deep when there's a job opening. There certainly isn't any economic reason to pay such an astronomical salary when the job could easily be filled for far less. Puzzling indeed. I actually gave it a lot of thought. Why would they unnecessarily pay this woman so much money when they could get it done for far less? Of course, I thought it must be some personal connection. I mean, she is physically attractive, and I know how that works. Still, $2 million a year? She isn't that attractive. So what could it be? Then it hit me. They want the people on the air to be doing extremely well financially, so when they chatter on and on about the stock market going through the roof and the booming economy, they actually believe it, because in their little corner of the world, the economy is great. Those for whom the economy isn't great don't get to talk on television, by law. It's easy enough to see why these pampered poodles who read the teleprompter are positively giddy about the state of the economy. If I were making $2 million a year, I'd be giddy too. I think a closer examination of the economy and the middle class depression would reveal a great deal about why the Bristol stands were half full. And if that observation is correct, I'll feel a lot better about things. We can sort of live through an economic depression, painful though it may be, but we can't survive a loss of enthusiasm. And that is my fear. My concern is the constant and continuous loss of local tracks over the decades has taken the enthusiasm for motorsports out of the public. You see, the local short tracks, as they are often called, didn't just produce the next generation of drivers. They also created the next generation of fans. That's right, the most important people at any sports entertainment event, fans. Without them, there is no event. Where do motorsport fans come from? The local tracks are the breeding grounds for those who come to understand and appreciate motorsport. Without the local tracks, I fear for our future. I think I'll let you think about that for a while, but of course, I'll get back to it. Right now, it's time to get back to Motorsports Unlimited's efforts to try to fend off what appeared to me to be the inevitable doom of our community. In the last explanation episode, Explanation 13, I outlined our effort to include Great Lakes Dragway, better known as the Grove, in our efforts to save motorsport. I talked about our successful arrangements with Broadway Bob. I also explained why we never approached Santa Fe Speedway, even though it was one of my favorite tracks, having raced motorcycles there every Wednesday night from 1970 through 1975. Then I went through our efforts to include Raceway Park in Blue Island, Illinois, which yielded some participation, but not nearly enough to make a difference. In no particular order, now let's talk about how we fared at Lake Geneva Raceway in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Even though it's a little far away to be considered a Chicago area track, about an hour and 20 minutes, I include it because of the number of Chicago and Chicago area residents who own summer homes in Wisconsin, along with the fact that large numbers of Chicagoans travel to Wisconsin on a weekly basis to take advantage of the Wisconsin lakes and resorts, including Lake Geneva. I think this track comes to mind now because our 8th episode of Motorsports Unlimited, taped in 1986, more than 30 years ago, was a studio show featuring an interview with the then-new Lake Geneva Raceway track owner, Kevin Dawson. As someone who raced cars at the old Lake Geneva Raceway, I was aware it was in pretty bad shape. The track was terrible. It was a flat, quarter-mile, paved oval. When I say flat, I mean flat. At one time, there was a drag strip running right through the center of the track lengthwise. That meant the oval, when built, had to be absolutely flat in order to accommodate the drag strip. In addition, it had been many years since the track had been paved, and it was full of cracks and holes and in bad need of repair. The race cars looked awkward trying to negotiate the flat corners, and what was left of the drag strip in the middle of both corners upset the cars as they went around the oval at speed. It wasn't a good show, and I didn't enjoy racing there. It felt as awkward as the cars looked from a spectator's perspective. On the positive side, it was located in a beautiful part of Wisconsin, Lake Geneva, and enjoying the races under the stars was a rare treat, lacking only a proper track. When word reached me that the track had been sold, I feared that that would be the end of Lake Geneva Raceway. After all, the track needed extensive and expensive repairs just to be kept going at a marginal level. It was hard for me to envision anyone taking on such a daunting task. Then I heard the new owner had big plans for the place and was going to continue as a motorsport facility. I invited the new owner, who I didn't know, Kevin Dawson, to come to the studio and participate in an interview. He accepted, and despite the problems I was having with Continental Cablevision at the time, the interview came off fine. I was very impressed with Kevin and what he had in mind. He wanted to build an entirely new track in roughly the same place as the old one, only larger and featuring progressive banking. The drag strip hadn't been used in years, and Wisconsin winters had pretty much left it damaged beyond repair. Not to mention it lacked sufficient shutdown room for modern dragsters, so it had to go. In addition, it turned out Kevin was an off-road truck racer, and the property had plenty of room for off-road racing, not to mention a motorcycle motocross track. I was impressed with Kevin, but words and plans do not a racetrack make. It was going to take money and plenty of it. When he left the studio, I made sure he had my phone number and I had his. I explained what I was doing with Motorsports Unlimited. This was at the very beginning of Motorsports Unlimited. I think I mentioned Kevin's interview was Motorsports Unlimited show number 8. This show is Motorsports Unlimited show number 1422. It was a long time ago. Anyway, I told Kevin I would certainly like to include Lake Geneva Raceway in our effort to raise public consciousness, understanding, and appreciation of the motorsport community and its activities. Frankly, I liked him and thought he was very bright, but I didn't know if he realized what a Herculean task he was undertaking. I was happy someone was going to try, and at least, for now, the facility wasn't going to disappear. But I must admit, I wondered if what he outlined was even possible. Of course, it goes without saying, he probably thought I was crazy too. I mean, come on, a crummy little public access cable television show on a channel nobody watches, saving motorsport? What can I say? I thought I could do it. And I guess Kevin thought he could do it too. You know, sometimes impossible things happen because the people involved didn't know it was impossible. For me, there was no choice. I knew the spectators at motorsport events were too few to sustain the sport, and without a little television presence, the spectator count would inevitably go down even further. At some point, we would be gone. Of course, the smart ones just left, but that wasn't an option for me. I was passionate about motorsport, and probably more significant, I thought it was culturally important, so I knew I had to fix it. I didn't know what was motivating Kevin Dawson at the time, but I suspected he wanted to bring off-road truck racing into Wisconsin in a big way. It wasn't anything he said, but more of an impression. He seemed passionate about off-road trucks, and as a track owner with plenty of space for an off-road truck course, it seemed like a direction he would pursue. Whatever it was, I was glad he was planning on keeping Lake Geneva Raceway a motorsport facility. 6 years later, Motorsports Unlimited visited Lake Geneva Raceway for the first time since Kevin Dawson took the controls. I was astonished at what he'd achieved. The buildings were all either new or refurbished, and he'd added VIP and corporate spectator suites complete with air conditioning and heat. The Lake Geneva Raceway I raced at never looked like this. I was really quite stunned. Of course, I'd heard a rumor or two over the years about the construction being done at Lake Geneva Raceway, but those rumors were about the track, not the amenities. I didn't expect all this. Certainly the amenities were very nice, but the pièce de résistance was the track. Kevin had outdone himself. The track had gone from an old, damaged, flat, paved quarter-mile oval to a brand new, paved, progressive banking, true one-third-mile oval. Wow. Talk about under-promising and over-delivering. Kevin had done it. I couldn't help but wonder, how? But the fact is, he did it. I mean, I was standing there looking at it. Amazing. The tricky thing about a bank-paved oval is getting the banking right. It's not easy. Everyone wants a two-groove racetrack, but few ever achieve it. For those who don't know what a groove is on a racetrack, it's the sweet way around. Inevitably, when race cars, or motorcycles for that matter, go around a racetrack, they will find the fastest line as speed gets faster and faster. The track sort of forces the driver to find it. There are all kinds of forces involved, from traction to coefficient of friction to centrifugal force. A good driver and top-notch team will eventually find the fastest line around the track, and we call that line the groove. The problem with that is, it doesn't make much of a show. I mean, if the fastest car gets to the front and he's in the groove, it isn't likely a slower car or even an equal car will be able to pass, when he would have to move outside of the fastest line or groove. So, ideally, that means the ideal track would have two grooves equally fast. How? Well, it doesn't take a mathematician to know that the inside line of an oval will be the shortest distance around, thus the quickest, unless there were steeper banking on the outside groove. Admittedly, the outside groove will be a longer way around, but if the banking on the outside is steeper, a car should be able to go faster around the corner. Done correctly, two cars running side by side would be able to get around the track in the same amount of time. The car on the outside would be going faster, but traveling farther. The car on the inside will be going slower, but traveling a shorter distance, thus equal lap times. The reason it's tricky is racetracks are very expensive to build, and even 1 degree in banking can make a huge difference. And if the track design is off, you won't have two grooves, and tearing it all apart and starting over is well beyond the financial reach of most. You have to get it right the first time. I don't know how Kevin did it, but on the first evening back after a 6-year absence, the track was revealing itself as a legitimate two-groove affair. It didn't matter if it was the street stocks limited late models. Sport trucks. Or the all-powerful late models. I saw lap after lap of side-by-side racing. It was really quite impressive. Oh, before I forget, Kevin Dawson was also impressive. When he came to the studio 6 years earlier, he was overweight. Not really fat, but definitely heavier than he would want to be. Tonight, 6 years later, he was in excellent shape. He looked like he had dropped 50 pounds and had sort of an athletic build. I wonder if he dug the new track by himself with a shovel. I made a mental note to ask him his secret. After the opening interview and a quick look at the new amenities, it was time to go to the pits and see what the drivers had to say. As is our habit, we interviewed the top competitors in each division. By the way, for those who wonder how we choose who to interview, it's really quite simple. Typically, we conduct the interviews before the races occur so we have better light. When we arrive at a track, we ask for the point standing in each division and pick some of the point leaders. We do this so that when we tape the actual races, we have a better chance of getting footage of the people we interviewed. That way the program makes more sense. Usually the point leaders will run up front, and when we're taping a race with one camera, we tend to focus on the lead. It isn't an exact science, but it usually works. The selection isn't personal, it's just trying to figure out the best way to tell the story of what's going on, in this case, at Lake Geneva Raceway. Anyway, we worked our way through the various class points leaders. I made it a point to ask about the track and if it actually was a two-groove track. All seemed to agree. The new Lake Geneva Raceway was indeed a true two-groove track. Oh, sure, there were some who preferred to run the high line and some who preferred the low line, but all agreed both the inside and the outside could be used effectively, and winning was possible regardless of running high or low. Quite an achievement for Kevin Dawson. During the next decade or so, we visited Lake Geneva Raceway about twice a year. It seemed to me I tried to get up there early in the season to sort of set the table, so to speak, for the upcoming season, and again in the fall to conclude the season. Of course, I would have liked to cover the goings-on at Lake Geneva Raceway many more times, but I was learning all these local tracks were holding on by their fingertips financially, and finding the few bucks it took to cover our expenses wasn't easy for any of them. It was easy for me to point out what a bargain we were. I mean, the outrageous cost of network television. I had a good example in that I had a close friend who worked with the AMA to get professional motorcycle racing on television, so he knew the cost and shared the information with me. Typically, it was about $50,000 for production costs, to make the tape, and roughly $50,000 for buying airtime, depending on the time slot for which they were negotiating. That's $100,000 to get your race on television. Mind you, I'm not talking about network television, I'm talking about ESPN. Of course, our little public access cable television show doesn't have near the reach of network television that operates on a national level, or even cable network television that also operates on a national level, but only for those with cable. But we do reach the audience that is likely to buy a ticket and attend an event at a local track. While it's nice to get national attention, there probably won't be many people from Kansas City or Rochester, New York showing up at Lake Geneva Raceway in Wisconsin to watch the races. The few $100s it costs to put your race on television with us is pocket change compared to those guys. And we reach the local audience that is important to you. At least that's the discussion I had over and over again with local track operators. Of course, I had a good answer for me, as did they. It won't make any difference if someone offered me a new Cadillac worth $50,000 for $500. If I didn't have the $500, I'd have to say no. I understood, believe me. If I could have paid for it all myself, I would have. But I did that the first couple of years and nearly lost my house. I'm sure I mentioned this before. Public access cable television was turning out to be the most expensive free thing I'd ever done. I'll explain more about this as we go along, as I have been during these explanation shows. For right now, I understood the restrictions and realities the local track owners had to live with to stay in business. And more than anything, I wanted them to stay in business. So our costs were always cut to the bone, or we couldn't continue. And I guess they couldn't continue if their costs weren't cut to the bone. Sometimes being on the bottom rung of the economic ladder really sucks for everyone involved. There was no question in my mind that Lake Geneva Raceway was now among the very best of the local tracks. Kevin Dawson somehow did it. We produced more than a dozen one-hour shows at the new Lake Geneva Raceway, but the last couple of years the calls to come out there and tape were less frequent. And toward the end of 2006, I got the call from Kevin I dreaded. This would be the last year of operation for Lake Geneva Raceway. I asked him if I could come out and bring a camera to the track and talk with him about what happened. One of the things I liked about Kevin is he was always open and honest with me. If I asked him how much it cost for insurance for a racetrack, he would tell me. If I asked him how many people had to show up for an event in order for him to break even, he would tell me. I dragged myself and the camera out there and produced the last television show from the new Lake Geneva Raceway. Of course, it was on my dime, as are so many of the after-season episodes of Motorsports Unlimited. More about that later. Right now, I want to concentrate on what happened to Lake Geneva Raceway. And as always, Kevin Dawson was open and honest. I am always annoyed when people say the property became too valued to continue using it as a racetrack. I know people think this is true, but it isn't. It only looks that way. The value of the property is determined by its ability to produce revenue. If the property becomes more valuable to parcel off and build expensive homes, then that's what's going to happen. Now, my position has always been motorsport is cheated out of a fair opportunity to compete for public attention, while those we compete with for public attention are granted free television promotion time several times a day, 7 days a week, while we operate in obscurity. Obscurity means no television sports news time. Well, I'll be the first to say covering private businesses like baseball, football, and basketball is hardly news. In fact, calling it news is a fraud. But if our competition for public attention gets it, we have to get it too, or we can't survive economically. Keep in mind, I'm not talking about newspapers. They have no power. Television has become America's only viable communications medium. Newspapers are only important if what they write is repeated on television. I encourage everyone to read the Radio Act of 1927. This is the legislation that controls all of broadcast, including television. And you'll understand why I insist we are entitled to a fair share of the public airwaves. The law is clear. Read it. It's not hard to find. Years ago, I had to find it in a library. Today, we have the internet. Find it and read it. We don't have to beg these people to include motorsport in their sports news presentation. They do not have free speech or free press consideration because only a tiny, privileged few are allowed to use the public airways by law, and they have a legal obligation to serve the public interest. In other words, we are supposed to be sharing this time. The most important thing Kevin said in this interview about the closing of Lake Geneva Raceway was,
would you still be operating? Would you have any plans of closing if you ran 2 nights a week here and put 40,000 people in the seats each night?
Absolutely not.
You'd be here forever.
Of course we would be.
Okay.
Yeah.
that's right. When the town of Lake Geneva decided to rezone the property north of the track, if Kevin had been making real money that large audiences would bring, he would have had the resources to fight and win the rezoning battle. As it was, he had to stand there helpless while well-heeled entities rezoned the area north of the track, forcing Lake Geneva Raceway to adhere to impossible regulations. It's not that the property got too valuable. It's just that it failed to generate enough revenue to fund itself and flourish, including necessary court battles from time to time that are part of modern business. When you're barely hanging on by your fingertips, battles like this are out of the question. It's one of the things I criticize NASCAR about. They are by far the wealthiest motorsport organization in the country. What, it would kill them to send part of their impressive legal team to swoop in and defend what was happening to Lake Geneva Raceway, not to mention all of the other local short tracks being killed in similar fashion? And I don't mean to get a piece of the facility for themselves. I mean a completely charitable effort to save these local racetracks. As I pointed out before, the local tracks don't just develop the NASCAR drivers of the future, although that's true. They also create the most important people in racing, the fans. The fans who learn to understand and appreciate motorsport at these local tracks. It's not like there isn't something in it for NASCAR if they intend to be around for another 50 years. Saving these local tracks eventually fills the seats of the so-called super speedways. Anyway, Lake Geneva Raceway folded in 2006 because it was unable to draw enough fans and produce enough revenue to handle the inevitable expenses involved in keeping a motorsport facility alive and well. This, despite having the best possible person running the place. Kevin Dawson was a real hero for taking the chance and pouring his heart and soul into it for more than 20 years. He used his considerable intellect to innovate and open his facility to many kinds of motorsport, sometimes because of his heart and sometimes because he was looking for a revenue stream that would keep the doors open. Either way, he wasn't sitting on his hands waiting for something to happen, and somehow, with all of his efforts, he kept the doors open for more than 20 years. He transformed an old, dilapidated facility into a modern, state-of-the-art local short track of the highest grade. The new Lake Geneva Raceway didn't fail because of the track or the facilities. It failed because of the ever-sinister force of denial by law of the use of the public airways to tell the Lake Geneva Raceway ongoing story to the public, as our competitors for public attention are so generously provided. In the program we shot with Kevin in 2006, when he announced it was the last season for Lake Geneva Raceway, he revealed what most people didn't know, including me. When the arrangement he had with the construction outfit to build the new track fell through at the last minute after having dug up the old track, Kevin sold his house to provide funding to build the new track. Of course, you couldn't possibly have known the story because America communicates by television, and when television omits an element of our society, they disappear without notice. And if it hadn't been for our little public access cable television show, Motorsports Unlimited, you wouldn't have known this much. What more can you ask of someone? I said before, Kevin Dawson is one of the heroes in motorsport. He almost single-handedly saved the original Lake Geneva Raceway and, through guts, determination, innovation, intellect, and, I'm sure, sleepless nights, created the new Lake Geneva Raceway that operated successfully against all odds for more than 2 decades. Oh, before I forget, I did ask Kevin how he lost all the weight and kept it off for more than 20 years. He said, buy a racetrack and try to survive off of it, and you'll stop eating too. Just a few more thoughts before we conclude our Lake Geneva Raceway story. Sadly, I haven't seen or heard from Kevin Dawson since we taped the Lake Geneva Raceway closing episode. I must admit, I'm really surprised. Kevin was such a talented guy. I was sure he would show up somewhere, sometime down the road, involved in motorsport in a big way. The motorsport community can't afford to lose the Kevin Dawsons of this world. I expected to hear Kevin was heavily involved in some racetrack or racing team somewhere. But, to my knowledge, it hasn't happened. It's been almost 15 years since the Lake Geneva Raceway closing show, and I've heard nothing. Now, it may be Kevin is running a track somewhere in Wisconsin or perhaps a race team, and word just hasn't gotten to me. I suppose it's also possible he pursued his future outside of motorsport, joining what I often refer to as the smart ones. You know, those who see the handwriting on the wall and bail out. One could hardly blame him. If that's the case, too bad for motorsport and the motorsport community. Oh, in addition to all of his other skills and talents, he is, or was, among the very best in racetrack announcers. Serious race fans know an announcer can make or break the entertainment value of a motorsport event, and Kevin was right up there with Wayne Adams Sr., Jan Gabriel, 20 Grand Steinbach, Dave Despain. You know, I'm going to forget somebody if I try to name all of them, and I don't want to do that and inadvertently offend someone who made a super contribution to our sport. The point is, the announcer is very important, and Kevin was a good one.
Inside row 2 from Pell Lake, Wisconsin. He's running hot. The Berry's Bar and Grill, number 19 of Ken Burkhoff. Outside of him, another former track champion, number 87, your current track record holder, Jamie Wallace. Inside inside of row 3, it looks like it's going to be Fran Preste in the number 99. I'm sorry, Fran Preste is outside of row 3 in the number 99 car. Inside of row 3, young Bill Skinner Jr., also from Pell Lake. He is last week's feature winner, so a good, tough field. The 6 fastest cars here by virtue of their qualifying time tonight. The late model Dash for Cash.
We were committed to doing the best we could with what we had, and that wasn't exactly small potatoes either. Our stuff is pretty good, but we had no illusions about what we could do. I think we did pretty well with what we had to work with. But now that the track is gone, I sure would have liked getting some network quality footage to show off what Lake Geneva Raceway was. Well, as I said, at least we have something. Now let me take a moment to talk about what I mean when I say television. I say the word so often, so you should know what I'm talking about. Isn't it interesting that you should have to hear what happened to Lake Geneva Raceway from me, host of a crummy little public access cable television series, who actually chose not to attend college? Perhaps that says more about college than it does about me. Don't think because I didn't attend college I'm not educated. That's a marketing lie. We all educate ourselves in one way or another. We don't turn off our brains when we become 18 years of age and stop learning. We all learn one way or the other. Some of us choose to do it the hard way, and some of us choose to do it the easy way. But we all continuously educate ourselves. Make no mistake about it. There are pluses and minuses on both paths. Those who choose the easy path of formal education, produced and manicured by a small segment of our society, get a lot very quickly at the expense. Yes, I said expense. I'm an engineer, and we live by the notion you don't get something for nothing. To get something, you have to give up something. And in this case of selecting store-bought education, one accepts the inevitable processing. It's unavoidable. I'm not the first to observe that an inevitable part of education is indoctrination. Perhaps it's my education that leads me to see things in a different way than most. I don't accept the notion that television is a device available only to a privileged few, and those who control it control the country. I know that those who control it control the country, but I cannot accept that it is the province of a privileged few. Of course, to understand what I mean, we must define the word television as I use it. It's the device I hold responsible for what has happened to the motorsport community. I've seen it in my lifetime. Previously, I've stated clearly, television is more powerful than any nuclear weapon ever devised. But what am I talking about? Television, a box of wires and electronics. At one time, a cathode ray tube capable of producing sounds and pictures electronically. Today, it's LED screens and more. Is that what I'm talking about? Does that mean I'm on television when I stand in the line at McDonald's and see myself on their closed-circuit television system? Or am I talking about being observed on a security camera while shopping at Walmart? Or am I including ringing the doorbell at a home with one of the many home security systems? No, of course not. None of them have the ability to influence the entire nation simultaneously. I'm talking about network television. Now, I guess that needs some explaining too. I've actually had local network television on-air personalities tell me they aren't network, they're local. No, my friends. You might want to hide behind the notion that the local affiliates are independent operators. They are not. They are all branches of the same tree, a tree that both provides light on some of the issues of our culture and shade on what they ignore. Shade to the point of denying life to those unfortunate enough to be trapped in the shade. Never before in the history of mankind have we had to learn to deal with something that has the power of television. The television to which I refer. I've talked about this before, and I don't want to detail it again, but for those who don't want to go through previous explanation programs, I will briefly restate. Television has a greater influence on our lives than any other entity. Think about it. Words and pictures in front of the faces of nearly everyone in this country every day of their lives. Unparalleled power to influence. The television I'm talking about is the television that decides who our nation's leaders are going to be and what products will succeed in the marketplace. The television I'm talking about decides who our next movie stars will be and who our next singing sensations will be. Somehow we've become so inured to what television is doing, we accept it as normal. Why? Because television says so. Every aspiring singer in this country is chomping at the bit to be seen on the next America Has Talent television show or something like it, because they know their career has almost no chance without being presented on television. Don't misunderstand. I like television. And like everyone else, I watch it all the time, except I admit it. And there's nothing wrong with the box of wires and electronics that produces words and pictures. What is wrong is its exclusivity, particularly in a country that guarantees in writing every one of its citizens free speech and free press, then provides it only to a privileged few, while the rest of us are left begging to be included for our own survival. I personally watched and am presently reporting on the closing of Lake Geneva Raceway because it failed to generate enough revenue to fund itself and flourish in large measure because network television sports news failed to include this competitor in the sports entertainment marketplace while providing ongoing television promotion of those they compete with for public attention. Sadly, I'm not finished with this postmortem. I sometimes wonder how many motorsport facilities will have to close before we stand up in unison and demand a fair share. For those of you who are fair-minded and wondered why I think I should be able to dictate to the television networks what they must do, I ask you to consider the situation in which the television networks operate. First of all, know this: they are not a business like any other business. The only reason they exist is because we allowed it. Earlier in this series, I went into great detail explaining the history of broadcasts that began following World War I. I explained how during the early days of broadcasts, with everyone on the air, nobody could be heard. I talked about how the Radio Act of 1927 came into existence, and when it did, the entire population of the United States was effectively silenced. This was done to ensure the privileged few who got to broadcast could be heard. Of course, this sounds and is completely unfair, especially when we live in a country that guarantees in writing each and every one of its citizens free speech and free press. Let's face it, granting only a privileged few the ability to broadcast certainly flies in the face of free speech and free press for everyone. A child can see that. Yes, part of that 1927 legislation was a promise that those who got the privilege of broadcasting would share the air and serve the public interest. It hasn't worked to include the motorsport community. Of course, in 1927, one could hardly be expected to foresee that in 50 years, changing technology would render broadcast the only viable communications medium in the United States. But that's what happened. Make no mistake about it, everyone on commercial television is there with the permission of the government, and only those with that permission may broadcast. I suppose the best kept secret in the United States is our television is no different from Russia's state-run television. Shocked? You shouldn't be. The evidence is in plain sight. Do you know that people are arrested all the time for trying to broadcast? Oh, never mind. Of course you don't. It isn't reported on television. You wouldn't know for the same reason you didn't know about O'Hare Stadium or Raceway Park or Santa Fe Speedway or Lake Geneva Raceway, not to mention Oswego Drag Strip or US 30 Drag Strip. You know all about Wrigley Field, Soldier Field, and Comiskey Park because they are included on network television sports news. Oh, not incidentally, baseball, football, and basketball have become fabulously wealthy, while the motorsport community has all but disappeared. Coincidence? No. I watched it happen. I guess that's one of the few advantages of being 76 years old. I've seen it all happen. I watched as those things television anointed with its greenhouse effect flourish and grow, while those emitted withered and are dying or dead or on life support. You can pick where we are, while basketball players argue about multi-million-dollar contracts. Yes, I think I have a right to make demands concerning a public resource, the airwaves. They belong to all of us, including the motorsport community. All of the Chicago area tracks I started at as a young man are all gone. and gone along with them is the technical creativity provoked by competition. One can only speculate about what that might eventually be, the cost of that might eventually be to our culture. When I talk about this, I often remind people the auto industry wasn't started by a large corporation or a university study or a government program. It was two guys in a garage, the Duryea brothers. We tell the story on Motorsports Unlimited every year and celebrate their achievement by gathering at the Rock to tip our hats to those two guys who started the economic engine of our country for 100 years and counting. Similarly, the aircraft industry wasn't the result of some university study funded by a government grant, nor by a giant corporation looking for an investment, nor by a government program. It was two guys in a garage, the Wright brothers. Every time you get on a modern aircraft to take off on a vacation or business, remember, it started with two guys in a garage. Is there a lesson here? Only if you want to see it. I think it's unlikely we will ever see major change from a large corporation or a university or the government. These entities are heavily invested in the status quo. Change isn't good for business and ruins previous investment. I think there is a reason major changes like the auto industry or the aviation industry came from dreamers without an investment in keeping things as they are. Am I right? Who knows? I do know the racetracks of the world are places where people with technical interests can try their ideas and experiment and push the envelope of our knowledge. With the racetracks gone, once again, I've gone off on a rant about television and its corrupt practices. It's easy for me to get off track when I'm telling the story of another failed racetrack. That's right, this piece is about what happened to Lake Geneva Raceway. I suppose the story could best be summarized by watching a clip from the 8th episode of Motorsports Unlimited, taped in 1986, when I interviewed Kevin Dawson, the then new owner of Lake Geneva Raceway. Here is what he had to say more than 30 years ago.
Do you think it's possible for a competitor in the sports entertainment marketplace to survive in 1980s America without the network sports news coverage?
It's virtually impossible, Bill.
There it is. And he still tried. That's passion. When he had to close the facility in the final show taped at Lake Geneva Raceway in 2006, he told the rest of the story.
We've talked already about what your plans were 20 years ago, what's happened. I think you've accomplished a great deal. But like all of the other local short tracks that have gone by the wayside, this one too is now going by the wayside after 2006. What happened?
Well, certainly you could blame it singularly on finances. I mean, ultimately everything's about money, because if you have enough money, you can fight the fights. Regarding zoning, we talked about that already.
Now, is that a significant part of what you're up against, is fighting zoning problems?
It is to some degree, because the property just north of the racetrack was rezoned into residential, and since noise ordinances, and just because you're grandfather doesn't mean you have a right to violate noise ordinances. So they're not, the city of Lake Geneva, in fairness to them, is not saying you have to close, you can't race. What they are saying is you have to meet current noise ordinances, or will have to as soon as somebody figures out their own laws.
Which you can't do, yeah, which you can't do.
Right, but it's because of the rezone, which means that the residential district is now close.
So the strategy would have been to make sure that the rezone didn't occur.
Absolutely.
And it takes money to do that, and lawyers and all the rest of it.
That's exactly what it takes.
Okay.
By the way, if you want to check out the entire Lake Geneva story, starting with the Kevin Dawson interview when he first acquired Lake Geneva Raceway, of which I've been showing you clips, the show is on YouTube titled Lake Geneva Raceway with Kevin Dawson, 1986. You can also find the Lake Geneva Raceway closing show on YouTube titled Lake Geneva Raceway Closing. Again, you've been looking at clips from that show. As time permits, I will upload all of the Lake Geneva Raceway shows. Several are already there. Looking back, I suppose I should have known our little public access cable television series, Motorsports Unlimited, would be too little too late. And I guess I knew it. But in the back of my mind, I hoped there would be some decent, fair-minded people in broadcast television who would be prompted by our work or their conscience and start including motorsport in their television news coverage. I guess I sort of hoped we could be the fuse that would light the fire of bringing television attention to motorsports. Perhaps if I'd been in a position to cover the activities at Lake Geneva Raceway on a regular basis, or if Kevin had the resources to cover our expenses on a regular basis. Kevin did his best, and I did my best. Actually, Motorsports Unlimited was airing on the Milwaukee cable system for many years. I did this in part because I thought it might help Lake Geneva Raceway and Great Lakes Dragway in Union Grove, Wisconsin. It was quite an expense for us. I personally had to drop the tapes off every month in Milwaukee, and when gas was $4.50 a gallon and all I had was the big motorsport van, the 200-mile round trip every month was a killer. I guess everything boils down to resources. If I or Kevin had the resources, things might have ended differently, meaning not ending at all. Yes, if wishes and buts were candy and nuts.
Starts now. And you saw Al Shields Jr. take advantage of that from way at the back. As soon as it went green, he started racing. Every last position is worth a point. John Simon with mechanical problems on the number 4 car. And that didn't take long. It'll ghost up into the pit area. Yellow is out. Oh, for the 17, the black car against the black background. And I missed it over there. Rogers looking at it. Green is out. He can go racing. Two in battle for second. Here comes Ken Burkhoff. Whoa, the 27.
That's it for this week. And as always, I want to thank John Platania for helping me in the studio to put these explanation shows together. In addition, I want to thank Pete Bellinger and his lovely wife, Sandy, for helping when John couldn't make it. As you might expect, it's much nicer when Sandy is here to help rather than just guys. Come on, did you expect anything different from me? I'm Bill Wildt, and next week, I guess we'll talk about Ileana. I told you we weren't through with the post-mortem. Thanks for watching.
This program made possible in part by support from ABC Auto Parts, located on Ashland Avenue at 138th Street in Blue Island, Illinois.
Motorsports Unlimited is produced by Bill Wildt, president of the Motorsport Advancement Crusade.
This program made possible in part by support from Jimmy's Red Hots, located on Grant Avenue and Pulaski Road in Chicago.
Motorsports Unlimited was created to raise public consciousness, understanding, and appreciation of the motorsport community and their activities. You can contact us by email at msutv.com or email us directly at msutv@aol.com. We enjoy hearing from our audience and encourage you to let us know what you think. Now, this is not one of our usual next weeks promoting next week's program. This is a reminder that Motorsports Unlimited is now global on YouTube. Simply subscribe to Bill Wildt Motorsports Unlimited on YouTube and watch us anytime.
So that's it, another edition of Motorsports Unlimited and the lovely ladies of motorsports. And be with us next week because we'll have something real exciting. Bill Wildt's going to have the lovely ladies, and just about anything can happen right here on Motorsports Unlimited. Every week at this time, we bring you the best in motorsports. So be seeing ya. Bye-bye. And keep on rocking.